Everything is Awesome is part of Courts and Parts, a podcast network featuring pop culture, TV, movie, and geek podcasts. Check out some of our other shows, like TV Ate My Brain, Let's Chat with Revelin Friends, and Podstalgic at courtsandparts.com.
Awesome. Just tell people they're awesome and mean it.
Awesome.
Awesome. Awesome.
Did you have an awesome time? Did you drink awesome shooters and listen to awesome music and then just sit around and soak up each other's awesomeness?
Awesome. 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 That was awesome. You guys are awesome.
No.
You're awesome.
No.
You are awesome.
Sir, you are awesome. Seriously.
Awesome. Awesome. Awesome.
Everything is awesome.
Welcome to this week's edition of Everything is Awesome. I am your host, Kev, and this is the show where we sit down and talk to awesome people about awesome things. And this week's guest is someone who we've actually spoken to before. If you've listened to some of our SpareMin recordings, I actually want to say he was kind of like the pilot episode, or the episode that predated what has become the awesome pop culture minute on SpareMin. That we do once in a blue while. He is someone that our buddy Oliver set up with us because of our mutual love of Kevin Smith, which I believe we went on a pretty long tangent about last time we spoke. But he is a comic book artist. Recently found out he is a big fan of tabletop RPG and is a GM in his home games. Please welcome to the show, comic book creator of Champions, Dylan Jacobson. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Thanks for being on the official show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a while since we talked on SpareMin. So it's good to be back.
Yeah, and hopefully this time, I think actually the only reason our conversation ended before is because the connection timed out, and that's, I work in the boondocks where my signal is crappy and I can't get a good Wi-Fi signal outside of my office. So SpareMin is such a great idea, and I've only been able to take full function, a full swing at using it now that they introduced solo recordings, but during the day when I'm in no Wi-Fi country, it's just awful to try to use.
Right. I've had kind of the same experience, but like you said, I think it's something that's kind of pushing the boundary of how podcasting works. So it's going to be really cool. It just needs to kind of figure out where it's going.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really cool to kind of launch into it so early the way we did.
Yeah, and it's me saying awful. I don't want to put that on SpareMin. If Oliver's listening, I don't mean you and your app. For me, it's strictly it's literally a farm is next door to where I work. So that's my issues with it when I'm trying to connect to people. But it is awesome being part of the early people with it. Oliver and I, we don't really talk on a regular basis anymore, but about 6 months ago, probably 6-7 months ago, when we first started chatting, it was he found out I was coming to New York for something and he wanted to meet and chat about SpareMin, and it's cool that he includes me in a lot of the early stuff. So that's why I'm doing it's not a weekly thing, but that's why I'm doing an exclusive pop culture minute with them. Because he's just hey, do you want to do this? And we embed it on this other website for, a test thing we're doing. And I'm absolutely. And it is as you said, pushing boundaries.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really going somewhere. And I think the way I found out about it was kind of interesting because I was going through Bumpers. And Bumpers is another app that does, it might be able to do longer form podcasts, but it's kind of meant for 3 to 5 minute things.
Okay.
And I had just kind of run out of time to do long format podcasting at the end of last fall, and was I guess we'll give this app a whirl and do 1 to 5 minutes here and there. And then I found out that I don't know if it does a little better integration, but it does integration with SpareMin a little bit. So Oliver got a hold of me and was hey, you want to test that out and see how it works with Bumpers? And that's kind of how I found out about SpareMin. And then he hooked us up. So.
and that's like, and we're using right now Zencaster. My audience knows I talk about it a lot and whatnot, and for our live shows, they're actually one of our sponsors. Zencaster for me is like the way I equate the two, because I like having both in my utility belt. SpareMin's great for like on the go, or I know I'm going to do something short form. Anything under 30 minutes, I know SpareMin's like my best bet. But Zencaster gives me like the more, like it almost feels like I'm sitting in a studio. It allows me, God, I think I've gone 4 hours on this thing before, so it allows me to go real long if I need to. Which is, coming from, so that's interesting. So you have a background in podcasting.
Yeah, not super extensively, but we kind of touched base on it before. Kevin Smith and how gung-ho he is about following your dreams and goals, and how you should just have a podcast. Who cares if no one listens to it? Mm-hmm. So I was a part-time filmmaker for a couple of years out of college.
Yes.
And we had a small studio that we called Sequence 10, which was actually just named after a level from Assassin's Creed. But anyway, I urged my small group of filmmaking friends to podcast, and we would just do like a weekly update thing of like, this is what we're working on, here's the script idea, and who the hell would ever watch this? And from there I decided to kind of keep doing it, even though we kind of disbanded as a filmmaking group. I moved into vlogging for a while because I was going through a weight loss process, and so did that every day to stay accountable, and then did a local art podcast called Art Beat, which there's like 7 or 8 episodes up on iTunes, and we launched that last summer. There's just so many scheduling conflicts and stuff. Yeah. We were trying to do it live right out of the gate. We were doing it at a bar. We would get anywhere between nobody and like 10 people to show up, and it was cool. It was like the local scene, who's in town, who's doing what. We had our biggest guest was a Texas poet named P.W. Covington, who was coming through the area, and we got him on the podcast, which was pretty cool. But there's another local podcast company or a company, I suppose you would say at this point, because they're starting a what do you call it, a channel or whatever?
Yeah.
And so they asked if they could take Art Beat under their wing. And if we did that, then I would transition all of those podcasts to their server, and then after they've replayed the old ones, we would start making new ones. So that might be coming down the pipeline. I'm not quite sure. I haven't made any final decisions on that yet.
Yeah, man, that's a lot. But that's, so I guess for me, I've been around. I've been doing it for 10 years almost. Like this June will be 10 years of podcasting. So I've seen like how technology has changed in the medium, and really the biggest thing, because sitting down and speaking into a mic, whether it's in a live crowd or in a studio, you can't necessarily, like, I feel like that is where it's at, and it hasn't really advanced too much in the last 10 years. For voice, at least. I mean, it's just podcasts, just guys sitting around talking. But something that I've been doing a lot more is when I like. So you mentioned scheduling conflicts doing a podcast. That was my biggest enemy when I was hosting a podcast that was, everyone was local, everyone was in the same town. Let's all meet up, once a week to sit down and record. The more people you had, the harder it was to schedule. And I was a big fan, because it's how I started, with like the 4 or 5 man setup. Have it set up. It was more like a 2-hour radio program with segments and breaks and stuff. And I found that eventually it was like, you know what? Having one other person, having me and one co-host is the way to go, because then it's less scheduling conflicts. And that even turned into the point of now where it's just me and a guest, because it's so much easier to schedule something like that. And that's where, like, I just think the technology for doing remote podcasts has been like greatly improved in the last 10 years, for having to sit on Skype and having, like, we literally had like, I think 3 or 4 computers at one point set up to do everything when you wanted to do, including having a quote unquote phone guest. And I can literally now do that with one USB microphone and a computer.
Right. When I was in college back in like 2008, we purchased a bunch of stuff for the campus radio station that I was working at to simply be able to take calls on the air, which we had to upgrade our entire computer system and phone system to do that, which was just it was crazy to think about how much money we had to sink into something just to take a call.
Yeah.
But
it is, and I mean, I'm assuming that it's a little bit more complicated when you move away from internet radio to whether it's college or actual terrestrial radio. But yeah, I mean, it is an insane amount of the money that you can spend to get one little. You think it's something easy to include in your podcast, and it turns into being such a money sucker.
Right, it's nuts.
Yeah, and it's, I say this, and I say like the technology hasn't changed much as far as like, for in-studio stuff. I sat down with one of the the music stores that sponsors our Philadelphia Podcast Festival and has done work with us for live shows in the past, and like have said, this is all right, this is what I want to eventually upgrade my studio to, and it's like it's like about $1,500 worth of stuff. Which when you're a podcaster making $0 on it, it's I think it's a lot of money that you have to find to make happen. And that's the thing. Like, so I don't know. You were talking about Kevin Smith, and much like you and I have talked about before on the other thing, and I'm sure I've talked about on this show before, the whole idea of like everyone should do a podcast, which I totally agree with. I used to do it for the first 8 years. It was about like, let me find a way to make this like my career and make money off of it. And then it was only recently when I started this show that I finally took that approach Kevin Smith was preaching and was like, just go out there and do it. Who cares who listens? It's all about just having fun and getting that conversation out there. And I've never been more creatively satisfied and fulfilled. And I've had shows that are way more popular than this, but they always felt like a second or third job, where this, I'm probably doing twice the amount of work than I did on anything else, but it doesn't feel like a job, and I feel fulfilled about it. And I'm not a numbers guy anymore, but I do look like at the end of the month, and they do go up every month. So like, I feel good about it. Like it's all, I don't know, just taking that like stoner approach, I guess, is just it feels good.
Well, I can totally agree with that. I mean, even sidestepping into thinking about comics, when I started doing that stuff, I was working entirely in web comics, and yeah. I would sit and watch my Google Analytics like every day, and I'm like, okay, no one looked at that one. What do I have to do? And then I sold my soul to Reddit and started posting everything on there, and maybe there were more people who liked it than ever let on, but Reddit's just so full of negativity when people create something.
Yes.
Where I will just admit it, I was banned from Reddit, something I made, because I was posting stuff I made that no one liked. And it was so frustrating, but the thing was the analytics showed that those people went to the website. Yeah. So it's like, so I'm winning by failing. It sucked, and no one had anything nice to say, so it just beat me into the ground even further. So I don't look at numbers or anything at all, other than my Patreon, which is kind of my main source of income right now.
Well, and that's something that, numbers and stuff, and you mentioned when you would try to do a live show, and I don't know if this equates over to comics or not, because I feel like that is way more personal when you're creating something like that. And this is me, I can draw a stick figure maybe, so I have a hard time like feeling the like kind of what it means to create something in that form of art. But I imagine it's kind of similar because I take this kind of seriously. But for me, and I don't know how you felt about doing your live shows, or if this, like I said, equates over to comic books, but like when I go to get ready for a live show and I'm thinking about the audience size, I try not to think about it because then I get in my own head. But I also sit there and say, like, who cares if it's like 5 people or 10 people or 0 people? Like, if I was just out on my porch talking to a friend, which is essentially what this show is, like, why would anyone want to stand there and listen to it, you know? So the fact that people show up to these things at all is like, I feel great about. So like when I have, you know, I think that we've had like an audience size of maybe 35 or so people, and we've also literally had 1 or 2 people in the audience. I still perform that show the same way because, you know, who am I to demand people to sit and listen to me talk?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. When we did Art Beat live during the summer, if nobody showed up, we performed it exactly the same. And if I go to I'm doing an art event this weekend downtown in my hometown of Sioux Falls here, and I'm going to treat it the same as I would treat any other gig or convention, where I'm going to do, if one person shows up and wants a drawing, I'll do their drawing. I'm going to hang out the whole time and look professional about it. But when we did the podcast, the show goes on no matter what, but we had this gimmick of trying to get a loud round of applause at the beginning of every podcast. So even if it was just the guest clapping and no one's there, we'd be like, wow, it's a packed house, you know?
That's the only thing that I changed for our, because our live shows we call late night, and we do like a late night feel to it where it's me and I have my little sidekick host, which isn't normal for this show, and then we have 2 guests, and the second one's always like a comedian or a musician or something, and And when the first live show we did was for the Philadelphia Podcast Fest last year, and I was like, going over the show with my buddy, I was like, yeah, so like I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna, you know, hype the crowd up and whatnot. And he's like, asshole, what if no one's there? I'm like, all right, that's a good point. Maybe I'll just wait and sit on that one. And it is like the podcasting, and I'm sure, you know, I've only gone to cons and shows that weren't podcast related as an audience member. So I don't know. I feel like the live interaction is more so, you know, more podcast related, even though you do have to interact with people when you're at a con as well. But it's, I guess, way more personal, I guess, at that level, right?
Right. Yeah. And, yeah, because you really can't take it personally with a podcast, because even if no one shows up, someone's going to listen online. Yeah. So you have the listener. They're there regardless of how ethereal they might be. But for instance, I went to a convention last summer. It was its first appearance in Sioux Falls. I'm not going to name it because I've got a few negative things I want to say about it. But it was the most poorly set up thing I'd ever been to, where I had paid for the booth fee quite a bit ahead of time and showed up like 4 hours early, thinking that, you know, I want to be the first guy through the door. And when I got there with my table mate, who is the colorist for my next issue, we had gotten there before any event staff had ever checked in, and the arena we were at wasn't even sure if they were coming. And so we were like, well, I guess we'll just get first pick of the place. And eventually we got kicked off the premium table that we had picked once people showed up. But it was such a small turnout, especially for how much we had paid for everything, that I was terrified of not breaking even. And it was like, I'm in my hometown and didn't even have to drive very far, but knowing that we're not going to rake in any money is just, it's devastating. And also knowing that you're not going to network at all, there's not going to be anybody here to take your business card or like pick up a sticker.
Yeah.
And that's tough to deal with. But I will say, on the other side of that spectrum, I did have somebody kind of swoop in and make a gratuitously large donation in exchange for one comic book that basically offset my fees for the weekend. So that is something I won't forget either. Like, had I not toughed it out, had I not made it all the way through, that probably wouldn't have happened. So once you've committed to something, you just got to do it.
Yeah.
But,
so let's, and I'm sure we touched on this a little bit before, but for the audience that hasn't listened to that SpareMin episode, where does your origins in art come from?
Okay, well, let's start in the beginning. I think I was born in the year 1988. No, we won't go that far back. I would say in high school is kind of the beginning of things, because I had turned into such an angsty, ill-performing teenage student that the only thing I really cared about was my art classes, because they were the one thing where I was kind of let to do what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I had teachers pushing me in particular college directions, but I didn't even know if I wanted to go to school, quite frankly. So reluctantly, I did go to college, and I studied 3D animation and graphics for a little while, but the world of computers, as much as I use them, isn't where I want to be creative. And so that was a struggle for me, and I wound up taking one class making a film for like a freshman level class, and it was a 10-minute film that had a whole bunch of stupid things that you had to add into it. Like we had to have the theme song from The Price is Right, and we had to have certain character names and certain scenes that were just like arbitrary and completely asinine. But I fell in love with the project and had made the whimsical decision to transfer out of that school, Dakota State University, and go to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. So I signed my exit paperwork before getting approved or getting accepted to MCAD, and just told everybody, like, it's going to be cool, like, I'm going to get in, no sweat. And lo and behold, I got in, so I wasn't out of school for a semester. But when I showed up, there was no financial aid left because I had gotten in so late, and they got me into a couple classes, and I had to get an apartment and had no job and no money, and lived in Minneapolis where the rent and everything is extraordinarily expensive, and found myself doing better in school than I had ever done before for the first semester, but then worse than I had ever done before the second semester, because the crushing loneliness and debt became crushing depression while I was studying filmmaking in Minneapolis. So I worked on a good handful of films with various students there, but ultimately decided that it was time to go back to South Dakota and finish everything out at the college I started at Dakota State. And once again, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I just took a generals in art. So it says digital arts and design is what I studied. But I was still pretty gung-ho about filmmaking, and so right after college, kind of got hooked up with some friends that I had been working on stuff with before from Dakota State, and we formed a small film company that I talked about before. And our goal was to do things for cash so we could turn that money into like the narrative films we wanted to make. And we found ourselves just filling so much of our time with going to small businesses and filming like training videos.
Yeah.
So I remember doing stuff for like how to install security cameras or like how to lock the building at night. And I'm sure I'm in a handful of movies that are about how to do your job. But so while that was all happening, I had this just like irresponsibly deep love with Buffy the Vampire Slayer developing because of a class I took.
Yeah.
And wanted to somehow pay it homage or honor it, and had taken a lot of my storyboarding skills from the classes I had taken and decided, you know what, I'm going to make a webcomic. I have all these comic artists I love so much. I don't know anything about comics, but I'm going to make one. And it was a hideous failure. But it was a failure full of learning lessons, because that's kind of how I learned how to tell stories and make comics and things like that. So I had to fall down a lot to pick myself up.
Well, and that's all, you know, and I believe this is a Kevin Smith saying, like, all failing is success training. So, you know, it's you wanna fail. And I actually heard a really good story with it was on I've been listening to the Edge and Christian No, it wasn't on the Edge and Christian podcast, but it was another wrestler's podcast. It was Stone Cold's podcast. I started listening to that again, and he had Diamond Dallas Page on, and he was very good friends with Dusty Rhodes, and pretty much watched Cody Rhodes grow up, and he told this great story about in Cody Rhodes' junior year of high school, he went undefeated, went to the state championships and won, and then he finally lost in his senior year, like a couple matches in, and he was really bummed out about it. Him and Diamond Dallas Page were, I guess, super close. And he called him and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe I lost." Blah, blah, blah. Like, was really upset about it. And Page was like, "It's about time, man. Like, you need to learn. You need to lose to learn, because what if that was the championship game and you lost to that guy? You lose the championship. Now, you know how to beat this guy if you were to go up against him again." And lo and behold, down the road, state championship for the second year in a row, Cody's facing the kid that he lost to, and he ends up beating him for the championship. So failing is always, I think, a great way to find a way to succeed. And I think that's kind of like going back to earlier in our discussion, like that's what this Everything is Awesome podcast is. Like, I mean, I've hosted double-digit shows. Like, I think I've been in it for almost 10 years, but I've probably been part of and hosted and created close to, I think the last time I had a count was like somewhere between 13 and 14 shows or something like that. And, none of them are really around. I think, there's one that's still around that we do on a irregular basis. Other than that, none of them are around anymore. They all, for whatever reason, failed, whether it was because of, egos or schedule conflicts. They all failed for one reason or another. And now I'm doing this, which has been, knock on wood, successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think just looking at where we both come from with that creative standpoint from Kevin Smith, I would have to say, and this is with all given bias, that you're kind of living up to that expectation pretty well, which has been what's so impressive about kind of connecting with you as we did through SpareMin. Because I really think that this podcast is damn inspiring, and I've been doing my best to keep up with it every week, especially now that I've been making art full time.
Yeah, and that's nuts to me. Like when you sent me the tweet about, and we'll get to your comic book in a second, but when you sent me the tweet about that, I was like, he definitely meant to say at that Kevin Smith. Like, this is the first time that, like, me changing my Twitter handle from at HHWST to at that nerdy Kev has, like, someone finally confused me with Kev Smith. And I know that I'm like, I'm a little bit heavy like him and have a beard like him, but this is 100% inaccurate. But I DM'd you or whatever, or however I responded. Yeah. And then, like, you responded back. I was like, I don't really, like, he's just being nice at this point. Like, what did I, like, so it was really a warm feeling inside of me once I realized that, like, I think he really meant me. That's awesome.
Oh, well, I would say it has at least be both of you. But the thing about your podcast is you're always talking to new and different people from, like, every sort of walk of life, and that's kind of the thing I wanted to do with mine. And over the last year, I've needed essentially support systems like Everything is Awesome, or even Kevin Smith's podcast. Even things like Jay and Silent Bob Get Old, where it's really not like about restructuring somebody else; it's about restructuring Jason Mewes. But when I started to make more decisions about, I think I'm just going to try to be a creative for a while. Life got rough, and it's. Anyone can, if you can use something someone's putting out to improve yourself, then that's good for you, and you need that. So, it's surprising to say it's a support system, but it's a support system nonetheless.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Like, that's where, I mean, if you've been listening, and everyone else, I've beat it to death. Last year I went through losing my uncle to cancer. And, like, that was especially, like, when we knew, like, it was a roller coaster, because it seemed like it was going to be like, oh, he's going to beat it, no problem. Like, it's just easy street. It still kind of sucks, but whatever. And then the day before the Philadelphia Podcast Fest, we find out that it came back. And then that was when it was just, like, basically a downward spiral. And that's where, like, even though I was using podcasts beforehand to kind of be a crutch, that's especially where, like, I just dove into every podcast that I could find so that I could find an hour or two here and there to escape. And that's like my love of Campaign Pod, which is, a Star Wars Edge of the Empire podcast. Like that, my love of that, like they helped me big time. And, Kevin Smith, and more so than even Kevin Smith, the Tell 'em Steve Dave boys, I think their podcast on that network is the one that I have never given up for a couple weeks at a time. It's the one that I, for the most part, have stayed, listening to week in and week out, because it's the more real, I guess. There's, except for Q, I guess, it's all a bunch of guys that really, are, until I guess recently with Comic Book Men, just kind of everyday dudes. And even Comic Book Man, I don't think has changed them at all. So that was the closest podcast on the Kevin Smith network that resembled me. And they're just really funny dudes. So all that is is what I used for my crutch when I had my bout with depression, or just feeling sad, even just because of everything that was going on. So 100% understand, and I think everyone has a moment like that.
Well, I think people always assume that art is exactly like painting or writing or making a movie, and they don't realize that so many of the creative processes in their lives, whether it's putting puzzles together or playing Dungeons and Dragons, those are the creative outlets that people use to express themselves. And if you can find something through those formats that enhances you or makes you feel better or simply lets you express yourself, then that's a good thing. And knowing that there are people out there like you or Kevin Smith, I don't know how many times we can say his name in one podcast, but just anybody out there saying hey man, go do the thing, and just keep doing it. And who cares what the outcome is, because as long as you keep doing it, it'll be a positive outcome. Yeah. And those are powerful things to say, especially for anybody who's in a walk of life where, okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of my life philosophy real quick.
All right.
There's nothing wrong with having any job. I don't care what it is. They're all potentially good jobs. The thing is if you get up in the morning and you cannot fathom going back to it, then it's not a good job for you.
Yeah.
So there are days where I get up and I don't want to draw, but I know there's something fulfilling about it, where either at the end of the situation of drawing or partway through it, that I feel reinvigorated, or I feel purposeful, and I know that that's something I need to be doing. And so when you find anything that helps you get up in the morning, then go for it.
Yeah, I mean that's that is just a way of life everyone should be living by, and I guess for the most part, most people do. It's the rarity that I guess people don't, but and those people are obviously the ones that need to hear it the most, because that's that the not waking up and doing something like that, or even being entertained by something like that to help you get through your day or whatever can be a life and death situation in some cases.
Right, and I think it's often underrated how life and death things like that can be.
Yeah. Especially
just in given circumstances. Sometimes there's just, you need to hear or experience just the right thing to keep you grounded.
Yeah.
So. Yeah,
and it's for the longest time when I was a kid, when every teenager is emo and they can't deal with life or whatever. That's when most of the people I knew were turning to music or art. And I fall in the same trap, even though what I consider what I do art, but when I was a kid, people like it seemed like everyone was going towards music or like traditional art to like kind of express themselves, while there was me and my small clique of friends that like went to wrestling, and like that was it's guaranteed the reason why I didn't get into any like major fist fights or any kind of any real trouble in school, is because I was focusing all that energy into telling stories in the wrestling ring. And you know, I know without that, despite how dopey it sounds, because it's, you know, it's wrestling is purely you know, acting with a little bit of sports talent behind you. It is like it definitely saved me from, you know, getting into a lot of trouble as a kid.
Yeah, I think, like I said before, outlets like that are super important to everybody, regardless of what your outlet is. Like for the last year and a half, mine has been tabletop gaming. But I think there's also unexpected territory where you don't realize you're going to encounter like weird reflections of yourself, and sometimes you don't really like what you look at. And trying to figure out what's there in your life that makes it good in those moments is really important. So if it's wrestling, or if it's podcasting, or if it's writing, or if it's making a movie, like you need to figure out how that can reflect the good in you, and know that sometimes it can reflect things you don't like too.
All right, Super Friends, we're taking a quick break from my conversation with Dylan to chat about the next live event we're putting on, the Unofficial Wizard World After Party on June 4th from 4 to 6 p.m. at Amalgam Comics and Coffeehouse on Frankfurt Ave in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From 4 to 5, we're going to have a quest for magic and steel. They're going to give us some family-style D&D. From 5 to 6, it's going to be Everything is Awesome late night. Mike and I will sit around. We're going to chat about Wizard World. Mike's going to be there all 4 days, so he's going to give us the inside scoop. We're going to have Brian Guay on hand to give us some of his stand-up comedy. And of course, just announced right here, hot off the presses, we're going to have Ophidian The Cobra in the show. Ophidian The Cobra from Takara Pro Wrestling will be on hand to sit down and chat all things wrestling, podcasting, and whatever else he has on his multi-talented plate. Make sure you come out June 4th from 4 to 6 p.m. at Amalgam Comics and Coffeehouse on Frankfurt Ave in Philadelphia, PA. Come celebrate the after party for Wizard World, unofficially, of course.
Because I had, call it Kurt Cobain if you want, but I had like post-success depression last year when my first comic book came out, because I did a successful Kickstarter. We raised $1,300 more than we needed to get the book on shelves. I printed 1,000 copies. I had a debut on Free Comic Book Day at a local comic book store. We sold, something like 60 copies in the first couple hours, and it felt just phenomenal. And then after that, I was like, oh God, I have to make another one. And like, how is that supposed to happen? And what if this was just a fluke? And what if I'm not as good as I think I am? And what if everyone's just convinced it's okay because the cover's okay and no one actually likes it? And what if they're all lying to me? And that was maybe the hardest 6 months of my entire life, having to recover from success, which is a crazy thing to think about.
Well, and I think that's kind of almost like an unspoken thing about success, you know, depending on how or when you find it. I mean, what you described sounds like kind of a miniature version of what happens to most child actors, finding all that success when they're young, and then all of a sudden they don't know what to do when they're older, and they spiral out of control for, you know, however they spiral out of control.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. I've never looked at it through that vein, but you made me consider that before I released my book, about a year before it, I took a business class for artists and how to sell your work, and that really got me off the ground. And I started doing live events and drawing for people, selling sketches and stuff like that. And then that ultimately, one thing after another, led to me making a print book and leaving web behind. And I think about that moment from that class, because we had a day where we had to come up with our goals for when we're 35 or something like that. And I was 26 at the time. So I'm like, that's a long ways away, you know, that's 9 years. So I could have a lot done by that time. And my goals were to have one comic book out and teach one class, everything I accomplished by the time I was 27. And when I look at that, I'm like, well, I hit my goals for 35. I have no idea what to do now, and I don't know how to, like, what if I have an audience, and how the hell do I please them? And am I really this thing? Like, I've had so many moments of, like, imposter syndrome in my life. It's so crazy. But just knowing that things change can be difficult.
Yeah. I mean, luckily for me, I have not experienced that quite yet. We have not hit the, I say the moment that I get a whole bunch of money dumped in my lap from doing this is the moment that I start crashing from success. Until then, I'm happy to not take any money so I don't have that post-success crash with podcasting. I feel like but for me, like, this is like all gearing up towards podcasting is just such an easy medium to get into and focus on, because it can be as easy as me sitting in front of a mic and a computer having a conversation with sometimes just myself. I mean, that sometimes it's easy enough for me to hop on for 30 to 60 minutes and talk to myself, or talk to myself as Batman for an hour. It's
Right.
It's pretty easy to medium to control, and but it's all for me, I'm 30, I'll be 33 this year. So thank God I never wrote down what I wanted to have accomplished by the time I was 35, because that's frightening that it's 2 years away. But I would say when I was 25 or 26 is when I realized I wanted to be a filmmaker, essentially. And like, I've never, like, I am exactly, if Kevin Smith, and anyone out there that's listened to any of his Q&As or evening whists, like, know that, like, what, like, until he was on set with Bruce Willis at Cop Out, he didn't know what the lens names were. Like, he would look at his DP and say, this one, and use his hands to show the shot that he needed.
Right.
So very much like Kevin Smith, like, I know nothing about making a film except point a camera at it and we'll figure it out. And that comes from the mindset of, like, I more so want to be a writer, but I also want to control what I'm writing. So that's why I want to direct. And that's what, like, all this is gearing towards. And, like, finally, like, this year, like, after, like, talking with, like, this show, and maybe it's not necessarily this show, but the mindset that I have doing this show, where I don't go to Reddit anymore to promote podcasts because it's such an evil place.
God, is it?
It's, but, like, embracing I at one point thought it was going to be hard to interview other podcasters because I didn't think there was a good community, for, like, an indie podcaster to go to. It's couldn't be further from the truth. Like, and I think something that you being into tabletop role-playing games may understand, because I find the community is very similar, is that the podcast community is such a warm and welcoming community. Like, unless you go to that evil place Reddit, like, I don't run into a podcaster that's like mean. Like, everyone is just so, like, yes, like, thank God you're doing a podcast, because we need more of that.
Right.
So it's just like, finally, like, because I'm in that community, like, I'm taking a step in that direction of being a filmmaker by doing an audio drama. Like, we're finally kind of working on something that's scripted but audio, so it's kind of easy to do. And
I wrote a screenplay for television a few years ago for a contest. It did not win. But I was like, oh my God, I'm going to revamp this, and I'm going to redo it as an audio play for a podcast.
Yeah, so, and that's
that. Oh, yeah, I dig that.
it is such, like, and it's funny because I forgot how much I wanted. Like, going back, it's nuts thinking about, like, the last 10 years of podcasting for me. I'd say, if this marks my 10th year, about 9 years ago, I said, I want to, and I don't think I called it a network at the time, because I don't think podcasting had networks 9 years ago. But
I don't think they did.
But there was one of the podcasts I was on, like when I had to go on vacation, the guys did their own thing, and it was kind of just a separate thing. And I was like, yo, let's just like continue doing both, and we'll have like a station, like we'll have, that's what they were called back then. If there was more than one podcast on one website, they were stations, and like. I had, like, before networks were networks, I wanted to do a podcast network, and same thing with, like, I wanted to bring back audio dramas, because that was, like, not that I ever really listened to them, but I always loved the concept of, like, old school, old-timey radio plays. And,
me too.
And, like, it's something that, like, I was like, hey, like, well, this is something I'm gonna back in my mind. I'm gonna do this one day, and it wasn't until last year when I sat down and spoke with Erin McGathy that, you know, we were talking, and she mentioned something about like wanting to do a radio play. And I'm like, holy crap! I forgot that I wanted to do that. And it wasn't like until after like I listened to it in playback editing the episode that I realized that I wanted to do it. And so finally, like, we're there. Like, it's like, okay, we have our outline. Let's start. You know, let's just start scripting it out, and then we can start recording it. And you know, I'm super excited to do it because it is just like one step closer. I mean, all that is it's cameraless filmmaking, really. Like it's still kind of filmmaking. So I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. I fully support it. Do you know what, God, this is like the worst question ever to ask somebody who's writing a script, but do you know what the genre or style of audio play you're doing? It
is, God, I don't know. See, this is where I'm a terrible filmmaker, because I would put it's like, I'm going to stylize it like other audio dramas that are kind of out there right now. It's like a true crime podcast.
Sweet.
But fictionalized. So it's definitely, I mean, it's going to be like I guess a dramedy, like, you know, it's definitely be way more drama than comedy. We're going to play it as like everything that's happening is completely legitimate and truth in the world that we it's not even our world. Like we're playing in someone else's world. But I'm hoping that fair use parody wins out, if anything happens. And usually in this kind of scenario, it usually does. So I'm not too worried about it, because we're just having fun with it. But like, I'm not looking to make money off of it either. Like, it's simply like, hey, let's put it out there. Let's have some fun while we record it. But yeah, it's like a true crime podcast.
I dig that. That sounds like it'll turn out really cool.
I mean, once we're done recording, I can tell you more details about it. And speaking of, because we do have less than 20 minutes left, I do want to get into some of your the comic book that you are working on now, and maybe we can hit on some of your tabletop stuff if we have time. So let's talk about your comic book that you have out now. You sent me the first issue of Champions. And it was fantastic. I remember, I don't know, I think maybe you sent me like a preview, or maybe I like just super stalked you and saw your Kickstarter and saw the preview there.
That could be.
But I started reading. I was like, this looks familiar. But then I read the whole thing, and obviously, you know, by the end of it, I knew that I hadn't read the whole thing. And it was like, it's such an engaging reading. Like, I really dug it, and like, so do you do the artwork and the story for that?
I do. I write, I pencil, and I ink the thing. And then I shop it off to a colorist, because I would prefer it to be colored digitally, because then we can make changes on the fly, as opposed to me busting out like paint or colored pencils and then making a terrible mess and having to start the whole page over again.
Oh, God.
That would be terrible. Because I'm a traditionalist. Earlier I said that I love the computer. I love to use it, but I don't like to create on it. So I'd still draw an 11 by 17 Bristol board. I've been trying to get a Twitch going on that, but I'm currently living in a rural town where there's terrible internet, so Twitch streaming is poor. It is terrible. So Champions was kind of a long time coming. In 2015 and 16, I was working on my second webcomic called The Tide That Returns, which is sort of a seafaring tale that takes place in the 1200s. And sorry about that bell. I have a grandfather clock. But
that's fine. We've dealt with it for the entirety of the episode. It's nice little background music.
Yeah, it's letting us know that the hour is progressing. But anyway, so I was working on a webcomic called The Tide That Returns, and one of my friends who does these sort of psychedelic comics that frankly make no sense but are really cool to look at is like, dude, you should make a zine. Zines are way hip again, and the comic book store will probably carry it, so why don't you go show your work to them, and if they like it, maybe they'll carry a zine for you. And I stumble into the comic book shop with a briefcase just filled with comics, the things that I had drawn, and I was like, all right, I want to show you my work and see if you'd carry some of it here. And there's a guy who works there, our shop is called Rainbow Comics, and I'll just say his name. His name is Brian. And he's got this great, like, poker face, and I think it's because he deals with buying and selling, like, baseball cards and comic books all day.
Yeah.
And so he looked just, like, displeased the whole time. And I was like, oh, my God, he hates it. Like, he hates it, and I shouldn't have come in here, and this is terrible, and I'm just foolish. And he goes, you don't want to make a zine. And I was like, all right, here comes the end of the world. And he's like, your work looks like you want to make a comic book. And frankly, zines get given out for free because they're a tiny piece of paper folded in half, and no one wants to pay for that. So why don't you go away and come back with a comic book, and we'll sell that? And I was like, okay. And I ran out the door and texted a few friends and was like, hey, we're making a comic book. Imagine that. And I put The Tide That Returns on hiatus. I guess this can be the first official announcement. After the Champion series is done, I would like to bring that back as a comic book.
Nice.
But anyway, I hopped on the phone with a couple of friends that I worked with for 2 years, and we went to college together, so they're kind of creative cohorts. And I was just like, so here was my zine idea, and I was like, it would have had these 4 characters, and I would tell their stories in a page or two, and then jump to the next character, and we'll never go back to the old one. And they were like, so what characters did you have? And I laid out, I think, 6 characters, and we whittled it down to the 4 that are in the books now, Danny, Alex, Michael, and Muggy. And we were like, let's flesh those out and just make a story for them. And I used the plus sign or cross logo, a pretty ambiguous cross logo that I feel like relates to tons and tons of different stuff in the world, so everyone can kind of attach to it. And I had stolen that a long time ago from a band called Live, if you're familiar with them at all. So, Creative Commons or whatever.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll just take what I need to from here and there. And so I actually based those 4 characters off of different musicians that had inspired me. So Danny is Danny Elfman from Oingo Boingo, or, all the movies he's recorded stuff for.
Yeah.
And then Michael is Michael Stipe from REM. And Alex is a small-time Canadian musician named Alex Johnson. And Muggy is the band leader from the band Polaris from the 1993 TV series The Adventures of Pete and Pete.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, so that's who they all are. And I actually got a copy of the comic book into the actual Muggy's hands, which was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
And, yeah, so it was really cool to kind of branch it out and base off of people. And I put it in my hometown, and I don't know, I think that helped sell it around the region quite a bit. But I know I'm just kind of waxing here, but when I think about what I wanted to do when I grow up, the thing that drew me to animation and storytelling and movies is that when I look at the things that I liked as a kid, the things I liked them because they either made me feel like a better person or made me want to make something.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing I'm trying to give back. And so I feel like at least this story has a pretty strong, moral objective of trying to tell you to be the thing you need in your life and do your best to do the right thing. And maybe I'm trying to teach myself that at the same time as I'm writing it. But so I'm trying to inspire, I guess, is the goal with everything.
Well, and I think it's if you go into anything creatively, I guess number one goal is just to be fulfilled for yourself. Like, you need to be satisfied, but a very close second is the the hope that your whatever you're doing means something, whatever that is, to somebody else, whether it's like it inspires them or it just gives them entertainment or whatever. I think that's like, I feel like that's everyone's part of their creative goals, is to inspire.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think the underlying goal of like be the person you need to be is kind of the thing you learn in your 20s. And I'm 29 now, so I mean this has been under my belt for almost 2 years, putting this whole book together, and it came out last summer. But I think that's a big thing you need to learn in the 20s, is how to be self-sufficient, and that you can't really wait for someone to come like dig you out of things.
Yeah. And
especially in the first issue, that's where I was going with things. So I'm happy to say that the second issue is officially done. And it should be coming out to Patreon supporters on Saturday, because it's Free Comic Book Day.
Oh, yes.
So.
That's exciting. I have to there's a in the first issue, there's a character that is, I believe, robbing a store. That is.
Oh my God! Yes.
That's Jay Muse, right?
It is, totally. So when they were casting stuff for the Ben Affleck Batman movies, there was all those, musings, if you will, to make a pun,
yes.
About Kevin Smith potentially directing it, and he's like, well, that's not possible. But Jay Muse on Jay and Silent Bob Get Old was like, I would love to be in a Batman movie, and I just want to be the bad guy at the beginning of the movie that says, like, give me the money, and then Batman clocks him in the face. So I was like, all right, I'll let you do that. And, yeah, totally based on him. And I tweeted it at him a couple times, and he liked it the first time, but I haven't been able to get a comic in his hands.
Now that you say that story, I remember that conversation. I Get Old. That's awesome. That is very cool. And that's the kind of stuff that I really like. When I saw that, like that, for me, as I guess another creative type, is what like sells me on something, is when you pay homage to stuff like that. Like that's obviously, whether it's, because Jason Mewes means something to you, or at least the View Askew universe means something to you in some fashion. Like that, I saw that and I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a wonderful comic. This guy's going to be a wonderful creator. Like, I 100% know, like, there's no way that's not Jason Mewes, because
that's totally him.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I that's the kind of stuff I dig. Like, I'm huge into, and I think I get this from Kevin Smith, is I'm huge into like the references, the pop culture references that is within your own work, as well as like that the universe building, that like before there was a cinematic universe, before that was even a phrase, really. Obviously it's been going on for years and years and decades of years. Kevin Smith wasn't the first person to do it, that's for sure, but like, for me, he was my first experience of watching something that was interconnected. Even, despite there being trilogies out there, his stuff was interconnected without being directly connected, like a trilogy. And that's like so important to me, that everything that, like, every script that we either have outlines for or have written, like, we have we have our own universe of stuff. Like, everything is interconnected, and so that kind of stuff, just like when I can tell that you're paying homage to somebody, or making a pop culture reference like that, I'm like way into it. It gets me fired up for it even more.
I'm so pleased that you, of all people, noticed that. There's a couple other minor things in there, depending on what your tastes were throughout the 90s. But yeah, I love doing that, and being able to culture my own universe is a really exciting experience.
And I think,
least about it.
And I think that as like a creative person, like you can, like, I think it's just got to be fun to be able to say, like, I'm going to make my own little universe and have everything like connected, even if it's in the small, like, I know, like, the one thing that will never be part of like the universe that we're creating is this podcast, because this podcast obviously is in the real world. But like, I 100%, it's in some in every project I have, there's going to be some little reference to Everything is Awesome, because I have to. Like, it's just part of my universe building. And I think that's like finding ways to do it where it's not obvious, but it's just like it's there for you at the very least, and or maybe a small select, friends or fans. I think that's like a fun little challenge as a creative person, is to try to interconnect all your stuff without directly connecting it.
Right, and even just the little nods you can do, like you said, to friends and fans. Like, a lot of the background characters that have actual faces, they're people from Sioux Falls, and when those those people bought the book, they're like, holy crap, is this me?
That's
or
awesome.
Like, there's a record store that there's a concert scene, and the record store carries the comic book, and the only reason they said they would carry it was they flipped it open, and the first page you saw was that, and he's like, oh my god, that's our store. And it's barely definable as their store, but they just knew. I was like, yeah, this is your store. And they're like, yeah, we'll carry this book here.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, like, there's something, I know it's pandering, but at the same time, it's like, people really enjoy being represented.
Yeah.
And, I think it's a phenomenal experience on both ends.
Well, and I mean, that's something that I learned from wrestling, or specifically Mick Foley, is go for the cheap pop. It's okay. It's okay to go for that cheap pop.
Absolutely, especially if you can go for the cheap pop and not just do that. Like, if you go for the cheap pop and then get something more, like, then you did just fine.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that at all.
So before we let you go, because I feel like this will kind of eventually segue into another project that I'm working on. But so you mentioned tabletop a few times today, and it sounds like you've only recently gotten into it in the last year and a half.
Well, in high school, I played a little bit of AD&D too, which was fun and all, but I don't think we really understood it that well. Mm-hmm. And then I had a few on-again, off-again experiences with D&D, but last year in January, I began a campaign that I'm still in. So this is the longest romance with the system I've had, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And since then, I've jumped into another system called Dark Heresy. I'm running a system for Unisystem that features Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I've accepted to be in Pokemon tabletop roleplay that was built by a bunch of fans online.
What?
And
there's a Pokemon.
I'm running. And it's so complex, dude. I don't know if I'm ever going to figure it out. But and then I'm running 2 D&D sessions of my own. So I feel like other than work on comics, all I do is play D&D.
That's amazing. To this day, it is it's like something that's almost like, it's like the universe is telling me that I shouldn't play because it's so hard to get a game together. I have a similar background where we tried to play in high school a few times, and it wasn't successful. No one was taking it seriously but me and the one other guy. And then I would say about a year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, we finally started a campaign that was using D&D 4th edition, and it was but it was like also mixed with like a homebrew. It was definitely a homebrew setting. And then, I think with, like everyone does, they have their own house rules, and I'm not a GM. I want to do it a little bit, but that kind of part, in that I think before we officially hit go, the side project I was telling you about, it kind of relates to that, why I don't GM yet. But it is like I would say in the last year, we've had one 4-hour session, but I've played more on a podcast than I have with my actual like quote unquote campaign group, by just playing on various podcasts and whatnot. So it is something that I don't play as often as I want, but I love as a storytelling medium. Like I think RPG and podcasts go hand in hand with doing an audio drama, essentially. I think they're made for each other almost.
I think that's very true. The best, worst advice I could give someone about role-playing is pick a day of the week, tell everything else in your life to go away, and just role-play on those days.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
every Wednesday from 5 to like midnight, I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons or Dark Heresy, and I've had plenty of moments where my parents will call and be like, "Your grandma's in town. Can you come out for dinner?" I'm like, "It's Wednesday. I can't." Like,
sorry, Grandma. I gotta go beat the dragon.
This is an unchangeable thing. I've been doing it for over a year. This is like a relationship.
Yeah, no, and that's totally what I mean. That's what it is when you get, and I think that's with, again, it goes back to being a creator. Like, you're putting a lot of being a, not that I've played as much as you or have run a campaign, but like creating a character is almost as much work as creating. It's as much work as creating a character for, a novel or a comic book or something like that.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like this evening before we started talking, I helped a friend build a character for a campaign I'm running, and it took us maybe 2 to 3 hours just to build one character. So there's a lot that goes into just thinking about one particular player.
Yeah. It's like I said, I think that, and we kind of have hit this note a few times, but it's one of those tabletop RPG is one of those things that I think if you are having a tough time, that you can turn to as some sort of either entertainment or creative outlet to really like just help with life. Because it's, for me, when wrestling was just, it wasn't about like hitting somebody, it was about telling a story, and that's whether you're a player or a GM in tabletop, that's what that's what you're doing. And I think that's it's a wonderful outlet, a creative outlet.
Absolutely. I think everybody's got a story in them, and how they tell it is up to them, but they need to tell it.
Yes.
And tabletop RPGs can really bring that out.
Yeah, I 100% agree. All right, so right before we let you go ahead and give out all the plugs that you want to give out.
Okay, well, I'm terrible at Twitter, but I'm getting better at it. I'm Dylan J. Jacobson on Twitter. That's kind of my handle everywhere. If you can't find it under that, I'm The Dylan Jacobson, so facebook.com/The Dylan Jacobson. Or if you just want to follow the comic book, it's facebook.com/championscomic or championscomic on Twitter. And then last but absolutely not least, the most important place you can catch me and to get pre-released pages, all of the scripts as they roll out, and free digital copies of all of my content, you can check out my Patreon, which is patreon.com/DYLAN. That's Dylan. I signed up when it was still beta, so I have the shortest link you've ever seen.
Nice. Yes, it's Patreon is something that we quote unquote use. We have no one donates to it, which is fine, because like I don't put enough time and energy into it to like have that responsibility yet. So I'm actually happy that no one does it. But if you're going to drop some dimes on Dylan and you want to drop some dimes on us, go to patreon.com/thatentertains. I'm okay with that. But that's something that I like, we had one other guy on here that had a Patreon that, he was plugging. And like, the thing we equated it to is that it's literally for you, the fan or the listener or audience member. It is skipping one day of eating out or getting a coffee or getting a pack of cigarettes or whatever, and applying that for a month of pledging to your Patreon. It means very little to you to skip out on that coffee or whatever, but it means the world to you, the creator, for the month, because it's either A, how you're earning a living, or B, how you're starting to make a living or whatever, and getting rewarded for the work you're doing. And me and the other guy, what we said is $1 a month, $12 a year, $12 a year, bro.
Yeah, well, and a good way to look at it that Patreon's always telling people to say is, it's a tip jar, man. So just imagine, if you will, the musician sitting on the street corner with his guitar case open, and you flick $1 in there every day because you think he's great. Well, I'm only asking for $1 a month, which, like you've made some comparisons, is 4 large lattes a year at a cheap coffee shop. So come on.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I try to, like, especially when I plug other people's Patreons, is like, that's literally, if you enjoy this person's work, like, give up the coffee for one day, and you're gonna pay for the month of of the subscription fee, so go ahead and do that. We set it for Too Cool for Tabletop. We're gonna say it for Dylan as well. $12 a year, bro. Is $1 a month. It means the world to Dylan, and is no real sweat off your back.
Absolutely. Hey, can I plug one last thing?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm taking a book tour / road trip at the end of May, and I'm going to be up in Seattle and Portland through May 30th through June 3rd, I think. So I'm doing a bunch of gigs there where we're showing up at bars and comic book stores. They're already being planned, so if you go to Champions Comic on Facebook, you can see the gigs that are already available. You can show up, read books, check out some of the original artwork, buy buttons and pins and things like that, and support us in all new glorious ways as I try to get this book into new stores.
That sounds very cool. Hopefully you come up and spread it to Philadelphia one day.
I'll look into it.
Yeah. It's if you want to do a back-to-back tour, if you're not going to be, if you're there to the 3rd, you're going to miss out on Wizard World. Wizard World's done on the 4th.
I know.
But maybe next year. Plus there's I don't know. I've recently found out there's way more than just the Philadelphia Comic Book Convention and the Wizard World Convention. There's a lot more cons that I don't know about that I need to start investigating.
There's so many.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Dylan, thanks for doing the show. It was a blast talking to you again. We're definitely going to have you on the show at some point again, whether it's for this or for the other projects that are in the works. But really enjoyed talking to you. Enjoyed Champions. Go out and support Dylan by going to his patreon.com/Dylan. Go follow him and the Comic Book Champions. Check it out if you get a chance. It is it was, now I don't read comic books on the regular anymore, but it is one of my favorite reads in general out of everything that I read, novel or other, or comic book that I've read in the last month or so. So check it out. Champions is great, and you'll definitely see, if you're a Kevin Smith fan, and you probably are if you're listening to this show, you'll definitely see at least one reference that you'll enjoy. And of course, you can find this show on Twitter at RealAwesomePod. You can find me on Twitter at ThatNerdyKev. Yes, I basically stole that from Kevin Smith. I will admit that. I also stole this from Doom Thugs. We are the #1 podcast in Bucks County. You can find us on awesomepodcast.com or on Core Temp Arts at coretemparts.com. For Everything's Awesome, I'm Kev. We'll see you next time right here on awesomepodcast.com. We've been awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Core Temp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Core Temp Arts shows, visit coretemparts.com.